Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our VIDA podcast, where we're going to help educate military veterans and their spouses on opportunities in Web3. Our plan is to host a series of industry leaders, many of whom are veterans or spouses themselves, so we can learn about their journey down the crypto rabbit hole while understanding opportunities for transitioning veterans into space. My name is Chris Perkins. I'm a combat Marine veteran who spent 15 years on Wall Street before transitioning into crypto myself. And before we begin, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Luca, who have dedicated their time and resources to make this podcast possible. Today, for episode 14, we'll be speaking with Army veteran Cameron Armstrong, founder of VF Protocol, which is building a zero-fee payments network on DeFi rails, starting with NFT private sales and escrow. Welcome, Cameron.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things I love the most is speaking to veteran founders. You guys are in the trenches every single day, and I think your insights are particularly insightful for the veterans community. So as we begin, Cameron, tell us about your background.
For sure. So I'm not an academy guy like a lot of the other people on the podcast. I actually went to the Virginia Military Institute. And so I studied physics and applied math, commissioned into the Army as an infantry officer. So I did not do math in the Army. Spent 4 years deployed with my platoon to Kuwait and Afghanistan back in 2016-17. And then I ended up at Army OCS as a platoon instructor in my last year in. Decided to get out, transitioned to go grab my MBA in 2018. Was fortunate that Harvard Business School worked out, so I went there. So spent the 2 years kind of learning what the private sector was all about. Spent my MBA summer internship at Amazon doing finance to kind of hypothesis test tech and finance. Turns out I love both, but hated big tech. So I wanted to be in that kind of like ecosystem, but not necessarily in that role. Spent the second year kind of doing a lot of soul searching around is finance the path, or is like more tech, startups, entrepreneurship the path? I was actually leaning towards the high finance path. I'm going into a bunch of macro hedge fund like final round interviews that were going super well up until March of 2020. And so COVID hit and actually blew up my post business school plans, which was to go be like a hedge fund analyst. And so I kind of had some soul searching moments at the start of the pandemic, like a lot of people did. And I actually ended up coming on as a third co-founder to an e-commerce software startup, connected with another Army vet, West Pointer, a guy named Ben Faw. While I was at HBS, did some work with them on the company in its like early days, my second year. And then they wanted somebody to come on to handle kind of like ops and growth. And it seemed like a really good opportunity, especially compared to the landscape of like, who knows when the finance world's going to figure itself out. So I came on as co-founder. Sprinted really hard for 14 months. And then we were fortunate enough to sell that company back in July of 2021. And then a couple months into the integration, I realized that media e-commerce, which was the space that was in, wasn't where I wanted to be long-term. So I made the jump into crypto, and that's kind of like the initial start of VF Protocol. And so that's like the quick down and dirty.
I really appreciate that. So let's go back to your service and even your service in Afghanistan. Were there any formative moments that really shaped your vision going forward?
Yeah. So I think the like instant of like, oh, I know this is how I'm going to be, or like an acute event is much less impactful than kind of the continuous, even starting back at like VMI of the like, when you're faced with a situation, it's just like you get a like figure it out response, right? Like at VMI, it's figure it out rat. In the Army, it's figured out lieutenant. And like that kind of compounding, hey, I know you don't know what's going on. Like nobody who's ever been a lieutenant really knows what like they're doing when they start. And it's like really been the compounding of those moments of like new situation, new information, you have your team, figure out what to do. Like those are the things that have really kind of like shaped how I acted post-military, I think.
Yeah, totally. I remember all the exercises we would do in the Marine Corps where it was like, hey, you're surrounded, everything's going against you. And the question always was, what now, Lieutenant? And you'd have to kind of grit your teeth and figure it out. Awesome. Okay, so you went to tell us about your transition. You know, you came back from deployment. What challenges did you face? You know, clearly you went into business school. Why did you make that decision?
Yeah, so I actually, I thought I was going to go do math after the Army. Like I had studied applied math. That was kind of like like, I think veterans, when they're going into the military, they give themselves like oh, if it doesn't work out, here's what I'm going to do. And like that, here's what I'm going to do for me was like, I'm going to go do operations research, go work at like Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab or one of these places that like I'd interned. And when I went to go start that process, I realized that like I was wrong. Like that wasn't how that works. Like I could go get out and go take an analyst one job, like the kind of job that I would have gotten like right out of my undergrad. But I wasn't going to get kind of like okay, let me like horizontal transition out, manage a team, whatever. And so for me, realizing that I just wasn't going to be able to do the thing that like the way that I wanted to do it, I was like, okay, new plan, let's figure out what to do next. And then through a lot of like research and kind of talking to people that went ahead of me, but like VMI doesn't have as strong of a like post-military like pipeline like a lot of the academies do. I kind of figured out that vets went and grabbed their MBA. And so for me, seeing other people like you and other people in like further along in like the finance industry, like looking at their paths were also really helpful. And so the transition was a bit abrupt because I had submitted my refrat and then I had to figure out what to do. But I had some time to figure it out. And so did the MBA process, kind of got through by the skin of my teeth, if I'm being completely honest. Like the only places I got it, like I applied to a ton of places. I only got into HBS and Darden, both like phenomenal schools, super lucky to have both. But everywhere else said no. And so like that like was a little bit of a rocky start. But the actual transition itself, I actually wrote a pretty substantive like reflection on my 2 years at HBS on my blog, Wiser, WYSR.xyz. For anybody that's like thinking through like the pros and cons of that transition, they can check that out. But the long and short of it is like the decision wasn't made in one moment. It was made over a long period of time. And then the actual like actions of transitioning took a lot of like cycles of, oh, this is very different than I was before. How like figure it out, Lieutenant, kind of like, okay, how do you like join this group? How do you blend in? How do you like stand out once you feel comfortable blending in? Like, how do you do well? It was very much an iterative process, like a startup.
Any advice that you would give to someone who's going through that transition right now?
Talk to people. The thing that I wanted to do, which was kind of like a bit of a reflexive habit from, being an officer where like oftentimes you are the only officer in the situation and you're not like you have to hold in a lot of these kind of like thoughts and opinions and struggles that you're going through. Like that's the military in general. But like once I started reaching out and connecting with like my fellow vets that were going through the transition as well, and like, something would go on in class and it would just be like super foreign, right? Like somebody's recounting a life experience that was like completely different than mine, where like at the beginning of my time at school, I like would leave and I'd be like, man, like this is not my place. I'm not like these people. But as I like started connecting with fellow vets, I would have a conversation with them post class and we'd be like, man, that was freaking crazy, right? And they'd be like, yeah, absolutely, that's nuts, like that. And so you find those commonalities with people that have that shared experience, and that really helps it a lot. And it helps you get out of your head too, because it's easy to be like, oh, it's only going bad, when you don't realize that like, no, it's actually going okay. You're just like caught up in yourself.
Yeah, it's all about network and community, isn't it? And there's so many people that have made the transition successfully, and there are plenty of lessons to be learned for sure. All right, so you finish B school, you're thinking about going into traditional finance, and you end up at a startup, and now you're an exited founder, which is pretty amazing in such a short period of time. Can you tell us about your experience as a founder? What did you learn? And what lessons can other folks learn from your experience?
I mean, I think the first and foremost that a lot of vets like that I learned that a lot of vets I think feel the same way as like you self-select like a lot. Like there are veterans today who are like perfectly capable. They're telling themselves they're non-technical. They're telling themselves that they like don't understand this business thing. But like at the end of the day, like if you've identified like a need that some set of users have, if you understand that and have the empathy and then also the ability to coordinate people and resources to do a thing, like cool, you've just described like being a military officer, but you've also just described like what entrepreneurship basically is at its core. Like you hear kind of these famous stories of like brilliant technologist founders, like Google founders, Mark Zuckerberg's of the world. But like most startups didn't invent like a brand new technology. And like what they've really done is they've identified something different that has happened in the world of technology that can now be used to solve an existing problem. And so like the biggest thing that I learned was just like having like the self-assurance to be like, okay, yeah, you're going to come into like a million different problems that you've never solved before. And like, yeah, they might have a more technical bend. You might need to like read some technical documentation or dive in or learn something that you weren't comfortable with before, but you're still going to figure it out. It's the same like a grit mentality that you had in the military that's going to make you successful in that.
Awesome. Can you tell us about your journey down the crypto rabbit hole? When did you first start getting into it? And then how did you build your knowledge base?
Yeah. So I was raised on the internet. Like I grew up in the mid 2000s kind of chaos internet that like crypto really feels like. For anyone that was like hanging out on the MySpaces of the world, it will feel pretty similar. And so like my first crypto exposure was actually mining Bitcoin on my local machine and Dogecoin too later, back in like the 2010, 2011 era. And so like that was like my no joke first contact with it. I did it mostly because I thought it was like funny and weird. Like I didn't connect any of these big ideas in crypto around decentralization or kind of composability to like what this thing was. And then I went into the military, and did that stuff for the next 10 years. And so my real kind of like second awakening of crypto was over the course of 2021. And so I've been exposed a little bit to it a little bit in business school, but MBA types aren't super hot on crypto in general right now, but also just in general. And so 2021 was like when I started paying a lot more attention to it, and really kind of like the thought and kind of like the philosophical history around it. Like that's not really what won me over. The technology won me over, but that was like what got me paying attention. And so as I was doing this media e-commerce thing, as I was getting like more comfortable in kind of like technology as a whole, realizing that like, a lot of vets work on their cars and like are very tactile and they disassemble weapons. They figure out like how things work, and technology actually works like very similarly in terms of like you understand how this language like works and fits together. Then you use that language to like do things like write programs. And so like I was coming into this kind of understanding of like how to build things. And then as I learned more about how to build things, the way people were building things in crypto felt like a lot more appealing. So it was like this confluence of like my kind of like life path shaping me down like one way of thinking, crypto maturing as an ecosystem, and obviously a bunch of people making a ton of money always gets like people to pay attention. And all of that like came together to be like, oh, there might be something here. Now that I am fortunate enough to like have some breathing space in my career, like I should give it some serious thought, because like there's a recurring kind of lament in tech of like people who are frustrated that they felt like they missed the internet, right? Because now the internet's a lot more mature, or they missed mobile or social media. And so now there's kind of like this prevailing, at least in the space, like people think crypto is going to be the next social media or the next like internet. And like, that means there's a ton of opportunity for people that like take the risk of building something. And so like, those are like why it became appealing.
Understood. So as part of that educational process, it sounds like you were reading white papers. How else did you get up to speed specifically on educating yourself?
Yeah. So mostly trial and error. The scaffolding for learning and self-education is like super disparate, super all over the place. There's a lot of noise in the signal. But like when I started paying attention to it, there were a lot more white papers. Now a ton of projects like that come out like might not necessarily have them, especially in the NFT space, because there wouldn't be much to write about. But the long and short of it is like the organizations that have been around the longest mostly started out with this white paper, which goes all the way back to the Bitcoin white paper, kind of like saying, hey, if you're going to do a new technology, you should like write out kind of an abstract form of it first. So definitely reading the white papers of all like the top market cap protocols out there. The Ethereum Foundation has a really good onboarding. So like, I think it's ethereum.org has like a really good zero to like, I can buy something with crypto pipeline. Andreessen Horowitz has as kind of like the crypto canon of like, all the resources over the past 10 years. you can find a couple other VC funds that have some pretty thoughtful writing about like how to think about crypto stuff. But ultimately, it like comes down to finding people whose ideas that you like respect, whether on Twitter or now Farcaster, which is like another like crypto native social network that's coming out, and just like listening to people that are frankly smarter than me.
Got it. And you can check out the blog at coinfund.io as well.
Yeah, of course. I definitely have read that more than a few times.
No worries. So Cameron, tell us about your current project, VF Protocol.
You mentioned earlier, I'm building a zero fee payments network on decentralized rails. And so what that really means is I want to take anywhere where there's an existing transaction, whether it's like a debit, credit, APAR, whatever like mechanism value is getting transferred today. And I want to substitute in something that feels the same, but is actually this escrow-like primitive. And then I want to generate some yield, some revenue on those assets in transit, much like you would buy like treasury bonds or create a certificate of deposit ladder in like your personal account. I want to do that with funds in transit to give people the option of not paying a transaction fee, which is how like all payments is set up today. And so if you look at the Visas of the world, they let you run a credit card. They have like things at point of sale systems that let you pay for things with the, like on credit. They're kind of charging like a tax on the economy with these transaction fees. And that piece of it was kind of like core to how payments had to work in the past. But now in kind of like decentralized finance, we don't necessarily have to be like charging a transaction fee in order to make money. And so I want to kind of like turn that model on its head for people that's useful for.
Awesome. So what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now as you're building out as a founder?
Yeah. So as like a founder in general, I'm building in a market that like a lot of people just made a ton of money on and is now like a lot frothier and a lot, frankly, less exciting than it was 6 months ago. And so my initial use cases in this, like with this technology are in the crypto space. And so it's actually a real challenge to get like people to be using software in like a very new space. Like there's a ton of like structural things that make it hard to get people to try new things, not the least of which being that like you have to pay gas in addition to whatever like additional fees that protocols like use. And so like having to pay more money for these things, where in Web 2, you would just like click a button, or like, traditional internet, you'd have to click a button. Those are all problems that like every founder in the space is kind of facing right now. So like that's probably like the big one. But like other things that I'm running into as a founder are like the noise in this space is really drowning out the signal. And so like I kind of frame it as, I started full time in September of last year, and I basically spent the next 4 months learning as much as I could about the space. And I kind of came to the conclusion that like 98% of the space is garbage, but like 2% of the space is no joke world-changing technologies. And that like 2% is kind of co-opted by a lot of people that like didn't read white papers, haven't really paid attention to like what is different, like what is the like the distributed ledger technology better for versus a centralized database. And maybe don't care because like they can, launch a couple projects, get a lot of money really quickly, and then move on. And so like that's like another big structural thing that, through podcasts like this, hopefully we can change some minds.
Yeah. When I think of that 2% you're talking about, it really comes down to utility. And it sounds like you're trying to deliver real utility through VF Protocol. What can you tell us about the ecosystem that you're developing in? Is it Ethereum based? Is it EVM based? What do you use for your layer 1 or layer 2? Can you walk us through your ecosystem?
For sure. So like my kind of stack is I'm starting with Ethereum because I think the initial use case for VF Protocol is really in buying and selling NFTs, of which in the utility conversation, I think are primarily just collector's items, which is like not a market to sniff at or like to joke about. Like there's billions of dollars transacted in memorabilia like every year, but it's not the same thing as like technology being part of like core infrastructure to do something else. I think there's some interesting projects in the space that do that. NFTs are in the very, very early days of figuring out what that means. But if you look at like what a decentralized payments network like really needs to be at scale in the economy, you kind of need an additional hardware layer across the world, like the point of sale systems, to usefully feed in information back into smart contracts. And since you need that hardware layer, that takes a long time. So I'm like, what's the easiest version of these? Well, fully on-chain transactions. So that's NFTs. And so with NFTs, where is kind of like the biggest pain point around like specifically transaction fees and moving them around? It's the Ethereum ecosystem right now. And so like while VIA Protocol thinks of itself first like as a payments company that is using like crypto technology to facilitate that mission, maybe the technology isn't in crypto in a few years. I doubt it, but like maybe. But within that too, we're starting with Ethereum because that's where the high value NFT like transaction volume and activity is. And then if that kind of like migrates to a different chain, we do that. Then eventually we will probably need to scale up with a layer 2 or some other mechanism to kind of aggregate and then commit transactions.
I understand. So can we just walk through the way a transaction would work? So if I wanted to buy an NFT using VF Protocol, what would I have to do?
Yeah, so the key here is to think more Venmo than Amazon. So like one of the big differences here is that you have to like know the counterparty first. And so you don't need to actually know them. You just need to know the wallet who you're transacting with. So the way the transaction works is like you're trying to buy an NFT from me. So I'm the seller in this scenario. I set up a transaction. I set the asset to sell. We've agreed on it. If I had a Bored Ape, I'd sell it. And then I set the price that I'm going to sell it to you, which we've negotiated on Telegram or something. And then I set the whitelisted buyer, which would be your wallet. And so in that case, 3 items are set, click submit. Now the handshake that I'm calling them are instantiated. And so this handshake is basically open for a period of time for you to accept. You would connect to viaprotocol.com right now, but eventually other form factors will work as well. And you just would have kind of like a card that shows Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT, the price, and who's selling it to you. And you should know that it's me because we've talked about it. And you just accept or reject. And then in that process, that would be like that would be all of your work being completed on that side. So you hitting accept would send the funds, let's call it 100 ETH, to the escrow controller contract. And then for a period of time, you as the buyer have access to that NFT, but me as the seller can't get those funds until like the 3-day diligence period that we'd also agreed upon goes through. And then from there, if you figure out that the NFT is stolen at any point during that process or it's not what you wanted, you can send it back and then withdraw your funds as well. And then me as a seller could get my NFT back too. So it's kind of like this like neutral ground to put assets when there's asymmetric trust between parties. And so that's kind of like the most basic version of VIA Protocol with escrow today.
Got it. Sounds super, super interesting. So I know there are plenty of veterans and spouses out there who are thinking about becoming founders and entrepreneurs themselves. Can you walk through your day-to-day?
Yeah. So I split my days between 2 kind of buckets. So I'm a little bit different than some other vet founders because like I am also the technical lead on my project. If you are not doing that, you would not spend as much time on the development side. But my 2 buckets are distribution and development right now. And so distribution are all the activities that you need to do so that other people know your product exists. It's stuff like doing podcasts. It's stuff like meeting with other people in the space, trying to like generate partnerships. It's kind of fundraising as well, or laying the groundwork for future fundraising. And so like I'll usually get up around 7, ride a bike for 30 minutes, doing kind of like the early prep work for the day, make breakfast, do about an hour or 2 of like writing, hit the gym, and then the rest of the day is focused on either distribution or development piece. The development side is like gets pretty technical, but it's like shipping code to make my product or ancillary ancillary components to it better, or like extensions to it better. I mean, I'll usually do that from like 11 to 6-ish on my normal days, and then I have two-ish late nights a week where I'll like go to like 10 or 11, and then that's like my repeat.
Awesome. So looking forward, what excites you about Web3?
Within a landscape or like a sandbox of like not having regulators try to regulators being willing to let people experiment within the bounds of like reasonableness. I'm really excited about the idea of not needing to like not needing to coordinate with a ton of different parties when I want to integrate something. So, for example, right now there's a phenomenal like bank API solution called Plaid, where like you can integrate Plaid into your applications and effectively have access to people's kind of like debit and accounts in their banks. And for like developers, this was huge. Like just like Stripe like revolutionized the checkout process. It like if you were a developer and you wanted to connect to normal people's bank accounts, like you had to figure out how to like talk to the bank and make that integration. And like Plaid did all of that work for us over the past like 7-8 years, which is great. But like if you dive into the history of Plaid, the way that they basically did it was like sometimes asking permission, sometimes not, getting people to log into their bank accounts, and then running screen scrapers to effectively get the data with like the customers giving their data without the bank like really giving permission. It's just like super messy, super painful, and like in kind of like software terms, it's super brittle too. Like by brittle, I mean it breaks very easily if like the page layout changes. And so like as someone who like now has to deal with these like super brittle ways of integrating different applications, having a shared database that anybody can look at any time without needing permission from anybody, which is like this distributed ledger technology that, you know, the Ethereum virtual machine, like you are limited only by your creativity in understanding, analyzing, and like processing the data that's out there. And so like as a selfish individual that like doesn't want to have to coordinate with 100 people if I want to do something, that's awesome. But also as someone who cares about innovation, especially in like a geopolitical sense, like permissionless innovation makes the cycle time or like the iteration loop of people trying new ideas and building things just so much shorter, which means like we felt like the world has sped up like crazy over the past 10 years, especially like with COVID and stuff. But I don't think it compares to like anything like the next 10 years are going to be, because if we have all of this like data, all of this technology that you just like plug into and you don't need to like ask and coordinate, like you're going to basically enable an entire new generation of entrepreneurs, like probably most of which who would have not been able to be entrepreneurs in the past.
That's super exciting. So you gave us some advice for transitioning vets earlier. What advice would you give for folks who are thinking about becoming entrepreneurs or working in Web3?
Separate advice, I think, because I think Web3 is it's like all of the things in Web2 still apply to Web3, like thinking entrepreneurship wise, like getting stuff done, being really close to your users, like shipping and iterating on products, like all that still applies, but there's some like unique Web3 stuff that I'll hit on in a second. But like the first step to deciding whether you want to be an entrepreneur is like, no joke, just talking to entrepreneurs. I benefited from 2 years of like business school where like HBS would bring in entrepreneurs that I could meet and ask questions to, like some like a few veterans, but like mostly not. And like what that really did for me was like, I met these people, they're very like sharp and intelligent, but I'm like, oh, they're not like superhuman, like they're just people. And so like talking to entrepreneurs is like the first step to realizing that like, it's not like an entrepreneur and it's like oh, this is like a thing that you can do if you like try and work hard and like just put in the hours. And so like that's first step. And then as you like get deeper into it, don't just talk to people, ask them what they recommend you like read and look into and study. Because somebody that's like 3-5 years ahead of you on the entrepreneurship journey is probably going to hit like the main pieces of content that have shaped most people's thinking about it. Like, not that you have to follow everything that you read, but it's important to like know what the like there's, I don't know if they have this in the other branches, but like in the Army, like we used to call a doctrine a point from which to deviate. And like, but you need that central doctrine to know what kind of like in like whatever the context is, this is basically what right looks like. And so like the corpus of startup knowledge and entrepreneurship knowledge is really like the doctrinal understanding of like how to build a company, and then you adapt it to fit your circumstances. So that's like entrepreneurship, like learn the doctrine so that you can like make the calls when you're in the fight yourself. In Web3, you probably want to spend some time getting a little technical. Like you don't need to be able to read, Solidity like a master, which is like the language a lot of Ethereum smart contracts are coded in. But you do want to understand generally how technology works and like how the internet works, because Web3 is like following that cycle, and the things that are painful about Web3 are sticking points are all like kind of going through the arc of internet history. And if anyone's like interested in that, there's a couple like super technical veterans in the space, like Spencer McDonald. You should definitely have on here if you haven't already. He runs a Spearbit, which is like Solidity audit kind of DAO. But there's a bunch of other people in the space that are super technical. I consider myself kind of in that bucket. If you want to have technical resources, I'll send them your way. Just reach out.
Yeah, that's great. And what I'm thinking we should do is probably set up an entrepreneurs forum in the Discord that we have at VIDA, just for entrepreneurs to speak to each other and founders to learn best practices. I think it makes a ton of sense. It's a great suggestion, and definitely would love to connect with Spencer. Okay, are you hiring, Cameron, at this point in your growth, and if you are, how should people apply?
Mostly hiring technical folks. Like anybody that is curious about work in the space, I'm happy to talk to. Cameron at viaprotocol.com is an easy way to reach me. But mostly looking for like a VP of engineering type, so I don't have to spend all my day, like half my days in code. But if there are people that are like trying to understand like the landscape in the space, like just send them my way too. I'm happy to send them there, because it's like there's a lot of different products in the space that are trying to help funnel this, like, people that want to be in the space and want to not be, or like want jobs, but none of them have done it super well. And so person to person is still the best way. For non-technical folks, there's a platform, Twali, Twali, which I haven't hired through yet, but I'm considering it for when I'm doing more admin ops type hires. And so that's a resource to check out. And they have a weekly newsletter, which I think would be useful for folks.
Oh, those are great suggestions. And you said the best way to connect with you is via email?
Email's good. And then I'm at FrozenFire42 on Twitter. Kept my AOL Instant Messenger handle into adulthood. And yeah.
There you go. Awesome. Anything else you wanted to share with the audience today?
I think the last thing that I want people to kind of like understand is that all of the things that made you effective in your job in the military, like apply in the civilian world. You just got to learn like the jargon and the expert infantryman badge tasks of whatever industry that you're in, and you'll crush it. Like the scariest part about the transition is the unknown unknowns, but they quickly become known if you just like put in the work.
Awesome. Cameron, really, really enjoyed the conversation today. Incredible insights. And again, I also wanted to thank our sponsor, Luca, for doing what you do, and we're deeply appreciative of your support. For those interested in learning more about VIDA, please connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Please hit me on Twitter at PerkinsCR97. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next time.